Okay, so before we get started here and dive in, just curious to see how many of you have heard of the JWST Early Release Science Program. Can I see a show of hands? Oh, okay. And of okay, so there's could be quite a large range of what it means to know about it. And of you who have raised your hands, how many of you could possibly be interested in proposing or being involved in a team? Okay. So let me get started here, and then we can discuss some more after the talk. But as Nicole was saying, I'm going to talk about the overall science timeline, not just the early release science program in the beginning, and then I'll talk about the details of the Director's Discretionary Early Release Science Program. So the acronym is actually DDERS, since it is coming from Director's Discretionary Time. Okay, and the DDERS program has been under development for the past couple of years. And some of you, how many of you took the survey that came out last fall on the ERS program? Okay. It's based on, the development of the program is based on iterations with your community representatives, which I will talk about in a second, which is an advisory committee on JWST, as well as your input through that survey. So brief outline, like I said, we'll go over the science timeline, deadlines of interest to users, and then we'll get into the details of the DDERS program, specifically talking about why do we need a DDERS program and how it's different. This is a frequently asked question. How is it different from your typical Geo Cycle 1 program? Okay, as Nicole said, we are on schedule to launch in October 2018, and that's about 25 months from now, a little bit over 2 years. So it seems a little bit far away from the perspective of people who want to write proposals, but in fact, the deadlines are coming up in a not too distant future. So going forward in time first, we have launch again in October 2018, and then we have 6 months of commissioning. After that, Cycle 1 observations and ERS program observations are slated to begin. For the community as a whole, the first group of folks who get to propose for JWST observations are the guaranteed time observers. And these are folks who have dedicated a large fraction of their lives over the past decade and a half to building the instruments on JWST. Now, their call for proposals release comes out at the beginning of next year, and their proposals are due a few months after that. What's of interest to the broader community is exactly what observations these GTOs will be making. And so the full observation lists for the GTOs will be released no later than June 15th of next year. Okay, so if you want to think about this in terms of classes of observations that will take place in the first year. First, as Nicole talked about, we'll do commissioning for the first 6 months, and there will be some limited set of science calibration observations possible, but the schedule is pretty full. And again, science observations begin after commissioning. And a set of programs, of course, comes in with the guaranteed time observation program. And another frequently asked question is, how much time do the GTOs have? And that's about 4,000 hours over the first 3 years. That's 10% of the overall time available if we say that the nominal lifetime of JWST is 5 years. Okay, so we go back to this slide, and then after the GTOs propose for their observations, the GEO deadline then fits in here. We have the call for proposals coming out toward the end of the next year, and the GEO deadline will again be a few months after that. I think this is actually at the beginning, right at the first week of March. And then the TAC will meet sometime in May. And so the takeaway point is here's not only the rough timeline, but GEO and GTO observations will all be determined before launch. Okay, so what will the GEO program look like? Everyone's familiar with what typical GEO programs on great observatories look like. And so it should be similar in terms of how we're going to accommodate programs of different sizes, support for archival research, but we're working out the details now, again, in consultation with our advisory committee. So who is this JSTAC, the JWST Advisory Committee? So these are folks who are your community representatives, and they're charged with advising our director on optimum strategies for maximizing JWST science productivity. They were convened in 2009, and they meet in this building approximately twice a year. So reach out to these folks if you'd like. They are composed of not only people from universities, but we have ex officio members from NASA, our partner agencies, CSA and ESA, as well as representatives from other rate observatories such as Chandra and Spitzer. Now this is the list of the original committee, and we will soon be moving to a more formal users committee, and here are some new members of that committee. Okay. So in 2010, the JSTAC recognized that our science timeline is actually fairly constrained. If you assume a typical 1-year length for each cycle, science observations, again, will begin after commissioning. That's in April of 2019. And then cycle 2 will begin 1 year after that. So what's the problem? The problem is this. Already, in order to have science observations begin at the appropriate time, we have to have deadlines for cycle 2 proposals that aren't too far after science observations actually begin. So the GTO deadline will be 3 months after science data taking begins. Then we'll have the Geo cycle 2 call for proposals released 5 months after. And then the deadline will be about 7 months, a little bit over 7 months after we've started taking data. And so if the proprietary period is 12 months, the amount of data available to the community to plan their cycle 2 proposals and to get experience with using JWST data is actually quite limited. So how do we solve that? Well, the JSTAC recommended in 2010 that we form or develop an early release science program. And to quote from their letter, they said that the purpose of this program would to be obtain imaging spectra to demonstrate key modes and to enable the community to understand the performance of JW prior to the submission of cycle 2 proposals that will be just submitted months after the end of commissioning. The list of dates I just showed you in the last slide, basically. And then key to this program is that any data taken as part of it, in order to just address this dearth of data, should have no proprietary period. The key aspect here is speed. So in response, STScI has developed this early release science program with the goals of accelerating the process of discovery in order to maximize the science value observations. And the director is allocating about 500 hours of time for this program. The proposals will solicit proposals from the community for up to about 12 medium scale proposals for both the data and funding, and proposals are invited in these very broad areas of study. And proposals will be evaluated by TAC, which will make recommendations on which set of programs to go for. All right, so another key question. How is this program different from a standard Geo program? Well, again, the key is that the teams and the programs will enable the community at large to learn to exploit the science capabilities of JWST, not just at any particular part of time, but specifically early in its mission. So selected programs will be, of course, science-driven and substantive, which, of course, is part of a Geo program. But different than a Geo program is that the observations taken by these teams will need to be of broad interest to their subfields. The programs, the proposals, should be designed by teams with robust and diverse representation in terms of expertise and demographics of the community members in that sub-area. And that helps ensure that the studies will be broadly of interest, and then people will use the data, again, to learn how to use JWST. The data that will be taken should form coherent data sets and with lasting archival value. We are saying that if you can come up with a coherent program that's actually using multiple modes in concert, that's encouraged, although not required. Another key aspect, a very important aspect, is that the teams, after taking the observations, will think about what kind of science-enabling products would be most useful to your community to not only help to effectively observe JWST and analyze its data, but we'll form a legacy that people can build their following science programs around. And finally, if we're going to get this data out early so people can learn how to write proposals for JWST, of course, the data have to be taken early in that same time frame on the slide that I showed you a few minutes ago. The targets have to be scheduled early in cycle and within the first 4 or 5 months, most of them. And then if we have a change to the scheduled start of science observations, we would like for those target lists to be flexible so that if you have a very broad science driver, many different targets can support, observations of many different targets can support those science questions. And you can have some flexibility to move during the year and when your observations are scheduled. Finally, and we already talked about this, of course, for this program to work, all data taken have to be proprietary, have no proprietary period. Okay, so going back to the timeline, where do the dates for the ERS program, the DDERS program fit in? They come here. So when I was saying it's not too far away for the broader community to think about proposals, it is indeed true in the sense that that call for proposal will be coming out in just a few months at the beginning of next year. And I'll get into this in the next few slides, but there will be a mandatory notice of intent, which will be due a few months after that. This is not too onerous, but I'll describe the need for this later. We'll have a second release of the call for proposals to allow us to update some technical issues, documentation of some technical issues here, and that's in May. And with the usual cadence, after the call for proposals release, the proposals are due a few months after, and that's in August. The TAC will meet in October, and the significance of this is that all ERS programs will be selected, and then we'll be able to publicize them with around the time of the cycle call Geo release. Okay, so the proposal requirements, again, getting back to how this is different from a Geo program and what you'll have to address in a proposal in order to win DDERS time. First, there's a justification for being a part of the ERS program. Specifically, you'll have to answer how this program will help researchers in your subcommunity learn to do science and, again, prepare for cycle 2. You'll have to describe the science-enabling products that you think will be useful and will deliver on a certain time scale. And then this is a point that's subtle, and maybe I should spend just a little more time on this because it's been coming up in previous presentations that I've given. But this program should demonstrate baseline science capabilities. So you're demonstrating how to do science. And this is very different from, for example, calibration observations or commissioning observations, where you're trying to figure out if the instruments actually work and what sensitivity they have. So those have different purposes than the ERS, which you're going the entire way. How do you create a catalog? How do you select objects? And it's not just about verifying sensitivity or doing some kind of technical verification. Again, important, these proposals should be scientifically compelling. We have a team diversity requirement. We talked about that earlier already. Description of the observations, again, feasibility for early execution and flexibility in target selection. And then this goes back to developing science products, but there has to be a realistic management plan and budget, particularly to develop those science-enabling products. I said there would be a mandatory notice of intent due in March. So what's the reason for this? We need to convene a TAC that's not conflicted, and we'll also have sufficient expertise to review the proposals. So we need to know who exactly will be possibly putting in a proposal come next summer. All these materials in the NOI are confidential. And the requirements are just that you have a project title, a brief description of the proposed science project, the modes and instruments to be used, and then, of course, the people on the various teams, and a brief description of how you have a broad input from the folks in your subdiscipline. Another frequently asked question is, what do you mean by science-enabling products? So I give some examples down here, but the purpose of asking for data products or science-enabling products is first to allow, again, the community to build on top of that, to go beyond what the STScI pipeline provides or data analysis tools provide. And one particular data product or science-enabling product that will be extremely useful to the entire community is after the ERS programs are selected, you go first in trying to optimize what your observing strategies are in partnership with STScI staff. And so if we select ERS programs spanning a wide range of science and capabilities, then the community actually has models to develop their Geo programs with. So we'll make the APT files available at the Cycle 1 call for proposals release or near that. And then we actually can enable archival programs starting right from Cycle 1 based on the ERS data that will be coming out. So folks will be able to propose for archival science based on the observations taken by ERS teams that that aren't directly within the ERS science program, as described by the team in their abstracts. So other products are requirements of the program. The only real requirement that you don't set for yourself in your proposal is this participation in community briefings. So as the mission ramps up and people learn how to use JWST, we have to teach folks how sensitive the instruments are, what the technical challenges in creating observations are, what the technical challenges are in doing science. And the folks who will have the head start are the ERS folks, and they will learn, and from their lessons learned, they'll teach the rest of the community. And so we're organizing community briefings on JWST as a whole, but we'll use ERS teams as a focal point. So it's participation in these community briefings. There'll be 4 or 5 of them within the first 2 years after launch. And then, other more traditional examples of products developed by teams are software for documentation, again, beyond software tools that the Institute will already be providing, and enhanced data products, again, beyond the typical pipeline products that are needed for your science. Okay, so we're down to the last few slides here. And so to summarize, the goal of the program really is to help the community learn how to use JWST and accelerate that learning. And so in addition to the immediate release of data, these activities by the ERS teams will really provide a focal point to organization of our overall geo support of the community and dissemination of information in the early days of JWST on how it's doing. And again, we want to accelerate this because remember that JWST, we anticipate it will have a 5-year lifetime, 10-year lifetime, but the requirement is 5 years. So we need to learn how to use this thing efficiently as quickly as possible. And the final graphic to close is this. So we can either educate the community how to use JWST like this, or we can use the ERS teams as a multiplying effect. So for folks, maybe you have colleagues at home that are interested in learning more about this, and I saw some of you snapping shots of the timeline. All of this will be written up in articles, which will be published next month in the STScI newsletter. So you can look for information there. And that newsletter will also detail the events, additional workshops that you can attend over the next 18 months. And I think I'll stop there. Questions? You mean the target sort of amount of time to propose for? Yeah, the typical range, the standard range should be within 25 and 60 hours. So if we're selecting about 12 to 15 programs, let's say, and you have 500 hours, that's sort of the way it works out.